Jason, anything you want to say before we jump in, brother?
No, I'm just glad to be here, man. I'm looking forward to it. I've been waiting on this the whole month long.
My guy. So for those who don't know, this is the second time that Jason and I have joined forces.
Yep.
We joined forces with a few other authors to discuss my novel, Black Buck. We're here right now, and we will be coming together for the Sheffield Lit Festival, which Jason just learned about before we started. I'm so happy to be here. I'm sure people have made a dozen of corny jokes saying that this is a hell of a book. If you've read the book, you see people, it's so funny when they're like, hell of a book. He's like, I know. The other's like, I know. But it truly is. It could be called hell of a lot of things, actually. Hell of a history, hell of absurdity, hell of hilarity, hell of heart as well. And for me, just kicking it off, I was reading this and I was like, wow. And I told Jason this before we started. I said, wow, they actually published this, because this book is going against what Jack, the media trainer, who we'll get into, he's a character, both literally and literarily in the book. He advises the protagonist author to not do or say certain things. But Jason, as the author of this novel, does do those things, namely discussing the publishing industry candidly, discussing the concept of race candidly, discussing the concreteness of what it means to be Black in America candidly. And I'm just so grateful that you read this book, not just from the perspective of a reader, but also a young Black writer. Right, you've been around for at least a decade. You're the OG compared to me. And reading this book, while very, very funny, reminds me that the reality that I'm experiencing as someone who just published a book isn't anything that I'm making up in my head. Right, I read this and I'm like, damn, he's putting on the page things that I have felt over the past 6 or so months since my debut came out, and I'm not crazy. So thank you for writing, man. Just kicking it off. Speaking about your book, right? At one point, the protagonist, who is an author, enters a bookstore, stares at his author photo, and doesn't even recognize himself. He can speak to what his book is about from the marketing script, but when he goes off script, he has no idea what he's actually saying. For me, when my book came out, I realized that it ceased to be my own when I got an agent. It became less of my own when we sold it, and even further less when we published it. So I guess, what's been your experience with not just this book, but your previous books, going from a product of your mind to being transformed into something else that has thousands of fingerprints all over it and the impressions of others?
Yeah, no, I think you described it just perfectly, dude. Like, there's this weird phenomenon where when you're writing the project, you spend all these years kind of in secret with this thing, living with it, and nobody else has ever seen it. Nobody else knows what it's about. It's just you and the work that you're working on, the characters in the story, and it's all yours. But the moment you find an agent, you enter into the machine that is publishing, and that's not meant to be a bad kind of derogatory term against publishing. It's just a fact of life that, like, it goes from being yours solely to being yours and the agents, and then yours, the agents and the editors, and then yours, the agents, the publishing team, and then the reader. And somewhere along that way, you begin to, like, you start to, there's this weird distance that gets created between you and the thing that you actually made, because other people will come to it and they'll see parts of it that you never saw, or parts of it, maybe sometimes parts you didn't plan on having there.
Yeah.
But they'll see it in a whole new way that you never expected it to be seen. And so suddenly it's like you don't really recognize your own work to a certain degree. It's like, yeah, I do remember like this part of it. And there are all these new things that you're seeing in it. And it's really fascinating. Like, I don't, it's not meant to sound bad at all. Like, it's a really cool, weird process, but it's really fascinating. Like, you think you know your work, and then as soon as someone else encounters it, it becomes a shared project that suddenly is not just yours, it's theirs also. And they have as much of a stake to it as you do. And that's just something that you have to kind of learn to work with and deal with as a writer.
Yeah, man, I feel the same way. And it's freeing in some sense to know that you don't need to own this entire thing, that it can be a gift in some ways to the world. But what about your intentions, right? Like, I'm sure you had your intentions while writing the book, but then it's out there and you're getting all this new information that you didn't have before in the form of feedback from people on Instagram or reviews. I was gonna say on Goodreads, but I'm sure that you know by now that we shouldn't be reading them. I had to learn that the hard way. So So does that in any way change the way that you view your intentions for a work?
No, I think it changes it a little bit, but you have to learn to like not let it change too much of what you're doing,
Yeah.
because there's this weird component with writing where as soon as the work is written and as soon as it's out there, like it does become owned by the other people that encounter it. Like there are books that I've read that obviously I didn't write. There are books that I read that like it's my book. Like if I met the author and the author said I didn't mean this, I'm like, hey, too bad, homie. That's how I took it. It's mine, and this is the meaning that I take from it. So too bad for you.
Yeah.
And so when someone else does that with your own work, you still have to, at the end of the day, you have to kind of like hone in on like, this is what I intended.
Yeah.
And if you're reading something different there, that's cool. But is it that you found something that I did not put there, or there's something I put there I didn't even know about? And so at some point along the way, you have to kind of say, well, this is my intention in the future, and I've got to find a way to say it better. It's part of that long journey of writing, man. Like it's part of the craft and beauty of writing is that like, again, the feedback actually helps you, because when you see other people finding new things, you're like, oh man, I didn't even try to create that. And I've got to go back in now and like learn how to control that feeling that this reader got, or the idea the reader got from it. I got to control that next time. So it becomes this ongoing process that from creative standpoint is really exciting, really fun.
Wow. I'm going to pause right here because everyone in the audience, I'm going to need you to put your questions in the Q&A. Make sure to drop in the chat where you're coming from. And I bring this up because this is my time with Jason. I'm just going to be asking him the questions that I have about his book, the questions from my perspective as a young writer, but we're going to shift to you. So please drop any questions that you have in the Q&A and we will get to them. So Jason, right, I got a couple other questions that I want to ask, but going off what you just said in terms of people not forcing you to change your intentions, for you to remember where you were at and what you were trying to do when you wrote your book. What about criticism, right? Mm-hmm. You've been in this, you have not only survived, but you've thrived. Like, look at this. You know, by the way, we didn't say you were selected by Jenna Bush Hager for the Today Show, right?
Yep, correct.
Right. So what I was thinking was you made that happen, so I wouldn't be the only one when you rolled in here.
Exactly.
Yeah, congrats on that, man. And it also feels like you manifested it because you mentioned the Today Show in this book.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. Like so much of that was like with this book, I really wanted to kind of poke fun at some of my past experiences as a writer. Like being a writer is a weird phenomenon. I think people don't get a chance to see a lot of.
Yeah.
And so I kind of wanted to really run through the gambit and like poke fun at like the publishing process, at authors, and how authors are perceived versus how authors actually are. So that, you know, there's a part in there where we talk about like the Oprah Book Club being canceled, you know, back when I think 2013, whenever it was, they got canceled, and like
Million Little
making
Pieces
fun of
or
that.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, the day the milk ran out with I think what it was. Because again, like there's this whole world of publishing that readers don't get to experience. And, you know, even if you are reading, you go out and you meet an author at a book event, you know, somewhere, it's like you get this very small slice of their weird, strange life. And so I wanted to kind of capture that, but there's also a weird pressure that comes with being a writer. There's a pressure with having people read your work and enjoy your work, is that like they want to enjoy it more, and you've got to find your space in the middle of all that. And it's a weird place to navigate. So I wanted to capture some of that insanity and also have a discussion about race in America and all those heavy topics in the course of this book as well.
I got, just as you're speaking, I got even more questions. I'm gonna get back to the flow that I had, but just going off what you just said, what about when readers want more beyond the book, right? When they want to commodify you as an author versus seeing you as a person who wrote a book. What are your thoughts on that, or how do you react to it?
No, I think it's a weird, it's a duality where like you have who you are and you have who people perceive you as. Yeah. And that's the story of human existence. Like that's really just the way it is being a person. Like we are all this internal version of ourselves, and then we are this external version. Of like our family sees us one way, our friends sees us one way, our significant others see us another way, strangers we meet see us another way. And so there's this whole thread about identity in the novel, and identity, particularly as black people, but also as writers, where as a writer, you are expected to be this voice of clarity for either certain demographics or just certain ideas or politics. And you're trying to navigate all that, even as you're just trying to exist as a person. Like you're trying to figure it out for yourself, in addition to help other people figure it out for themselves as well. So the book definitely tries to work around that. And like I personally, it's something I've struggled with and still struggle with, is I think it's an ongoing challenge of being an artist. It isn't just writers that kind of go through. I think it's artists of all types, where like you're always trying to say a thing. You know, writing is the lifelong pursuit of saying the thing once and saying it right.
Yeah.
And the problem is you'll never do it. You'll spend 90,000 words trying to say one sentence and never quite get it out there. And that's the challenge of it. And so that perception where like readers will see you as one person and they'll have this idea of who you are, and then you have this idea of who you are as well, and finding that place where the two can meet, that's always a tricky thing. They tell you don't meet your heroes, don't meet people that you kind of admire or like people you're a fan of, because they oftentimes aren't who you expect.
Yeah.
And that's a weird phenomenon, but it's a real phenomenon. Like I've met writers that I admired for years. It turned out to be terrible people. And it was like, oh, I wish I had never met this dude. So I hope to never be that for someone else. Like I hope to always be at least a pretty decent, respectable person when someone meets me. But it's all about that duality, man. Like we all exist in these two forms, in multiple forms, and trying to find the balance is such a challenge in life, period.
No, exactly. And I mean, we all bleed blood, right?
Exactly.
But what's tough, and it's funny at times, but also too real in your book when, for example, Rennie, who, for those who have read the book, Rennie is a Harvard graduate. Let me say that because it's very important to him.
You better say it.
He's a Harvard graduate, and he's a handler of sorts when the author is in a certain city. I believe he's in San Francisco at this point, and Rennie's driving him around. That's all I'm going to say about Rennie's background, because he's an interesting character who I liked a lot. But Rennie, like some other people later on in the book, turned to the author, the unnamed author, and says, you have to say something. You're a writer. You're expected to say something. And this burden feels unfair. And I don't even know if I can say we asked for it. But what do you do in those scenarios when someone wants you to be the voice of a people, the voice of a movement, the voice of more than just someone who wrote a hell of a book?
I think you have to find where you're saying at. You have to find your place of sanity. Because the thing is, writers usually begin trying to say something that's important to them. Like writing is a very selfish act. Like, let's just be honest about it. It's an egotistical kind of act where it's like, I got things to say and you want to read about it. Like that's a very powerful thing to say about yourself.
Yeah.
And so usually when we start writing, it's just from this place of, I have this feeling of this thing that I want to say, and we say it. And then if after you've written a few books, so you have any kind of like, even moderate success, right? People look at you, they want you to also speak for them, because oftentimes they feel that their voice, they can't say it in the way that you can say it. So they oftentimes want you to speak for them. And so as artists, as writers, as whoever you are, like there's this position where you have to decide for yourself, like, do I want to speak for these people? Do I want to speak for me? Or is there a middle ground where you can actually do both and try to kind of not please everyone, but like try to find your safe space and try to grow? I think as writers, you have to grow beyond just speaking for yourself. You still have to have those moments. Like you wholeheartedly have to have those moments when it's just you, but you have to be willing to like speak for others who cannot speak for themselves. And that's a duty as a human being. Anytime someone cannot speak for themselves, you have a duty to speak for them, I think.
I absolutely love that. And I absolutely agree with that, at least in terms of the way that I want to live my life. Some of my biggest inspirations, Nina Simone, Muhammad Ali, these types of people, Colin Kaepernick, right? LeBron didn't just shut up and dribble like that woman told him, right? He decided to stand up for more. Naomi Osaka, the list goes on and on. Speaking about facing things head on, quote, and this is from Jack the Media Trainer on page 106. This probably goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Don't write about race. Specifically, don't write about being Black. You can write about Black characters, but just don't write about being Black. No. This conversation with Jack the Media Trainer, man, I sped through it. I actually want to reread this like every couple of months because it took me out. It felt as though Jack was saying things that I've heard without people having said them, if that makes sense. You know what I'm saying? Like the coded language. But you did decide to discuss race head on in this book. You decided to include it heavily and make it a focal point of the entire novel. And it seems like you don't shy away from discussing it, publicly. What pushed you to do that? Because I found in my experience that there is a cost in bringing up topics, especially race, that make people, especially white people, uncomfortable. And the consequences of that can have people calling you angry, can have people calling you ungrateful, can have more material effects of your book not selling that well. And then maybe you not getting a large advance on another deal or another deal at all. So why? Why'd you do it?
Yeah, honestly, I did it because I honestly had to. Like there's a long winding backstory behind this novel where, you know, I had pitched it to a few people like a lot over the last 10 years. I pitched this novel maybe 2 or 3 times between my agent and like previous editors. And no one's really excited about it. And of course, like I didn't like, it wasn't about race at that time, but it was this thing that like nobody kind of wanted to really kind of come across. And there is this idea and this phenomenon where publishers, and this is not all publishers, so like this is not trying to like, you know, slander the publishing industry, but like there is this idea that like being neutral is the best way to move units and sell books and be successful. Yeah. Like if you pick a side in a topic that is kind of divisive and you say a thing, you commit to a certain philosophy or a certain politics, then suddenly you're no longer quite as viable as you were, because if you go into this camp, you're obviously outing yourself in this other camp.
Yeah.
And so that Jack the Media Trainer saying was very much patterned after some very code, like it was never said quite that directly, but it was wholeheartedly encoded in certain conversations about the idea that like, no, like just run down the middle, get as many fans as you can on both sides, sell as many books as you can on both sides, and don't commit to any kind of hard discussions about things. And, you know, there's that expression, I cannot remember the man who said it, but like he said that, you know, neutrality only helps the oppressor. And I find that to be a very true thing the older I get. It's like, you can't just be neutral in certain contexts. You have to talk about things, because the longer you don't talk about them, the more it just helps the people who are, you know, the oppressors in that situation. So for me, after my 3rd novel, I was out of contract. I had no publisher, and I told my agent, I said, I want to write a book about an author on book tour. My agent was still kind of like, you know, okay, cool, but like just whatever you want to do. So I went off and I wrote this book with no one seeing it. None of my friends really knew much about it. It was just this thing I did in secret, and it was in that wake of, you know, George Floyd, like so many events were occurring, and it was so overwhelming that I could not wake up in the morning without being frustrated and tired and sick and angry of like the Black experience in America being just magnified and like all these negative things. Yeah. So I started writing about that, and somehow it combined with that author on book tour. And I was like, well, I'm tired of being neutral. I'm gonna pick a lane, pick a side, and plant a flag and say the thing that I've been wanting to say for the last 10 years. And there it is.
Do you feel like you incurred a sort of spiritual or emotional cost in not having said these types of things before, or not having written about them in this way?
I won't say that, because the thing about it is like, you know, I've pondered, you know, I've been a part of these conversations my entire, like I did, you know, I marched in I did a march with the NAACP when I was 10 years old. Like there was an incident that occurred in my town where this man was shot, and it was like, so I've been involved in this. You know, I've been Black in America my whole life. So like, you cannot exist in this country and be Black and not be a part of these things. Yeah. And so for my writing, particularly early on, I wanted to be known primarily for simply the quality of the writing more so than the topic of the writing. And there's a weird knife edge balancing act that you have to kind of try to do there to make that happen. Because if you are a minority of any sort and you write anything, you cannot just be an author. You are the Black author, you are the LGBTQ plus author, you are the female author, you are whatever that minority is, you become that. And it is stamped upon you and you cannot escape it. And so I think I spent not too many years, but I spent a lot of my early career trying to be in that middle space where it's like the work alone will stand up without the topical stuff. Yeah. And so finally, and again, in the midst of all that, I'm still living the life of a Black man in America, still seeing all the things that happen, still getting pulled over for shenanigans. Like I'm still living the life. And I finally just got tired of only talking to my friends about it and not talking to readers about it and not putting it into my art. There's this moment when you have to combine your pain with your art. Yeah. I think that was what happened there.
No, thank you for that authentic answer. And I ask because there have been points in my own life, right, when I let things slide, or I didn't speak up, and then at night I'm beating myself up over it. So it's good for me to see that you wrote a book like this, and knowing that neutrality isn't the best way. It might be the best for sales, but it's not the best for us as human beings dedicated to real progress. So thank you for that. Going back to something that you said a little bit earlier, where you were writing this book without anyone knowing that you were writing it. You were out of contract. You had written 3 books. What was it like to go back to that almost pure, innocent state as a writer again, when you were, for lack of a better word, fully free again?
Yeah, it was a mixture of,
I see you
terrific
smiling,
and terrifying. Yeah, it was, dude, because it was great and it was terrifying because I'm a full-time writer. Like, that's what I do full time. And so, like, being out of contract means, how am I going to eat a year from now? Like, writing is a very feast or famine existence. You go through these upswells and these downticks, and like, you just kind of have to like figure out how to exist in that. And so for me, being out of contract, working on a book that like my agent wasn't particularly excited about when I first pitched it to her, it was like, okay, I'm taking a big risk here. But yet at the same time, it felt amazing to not have an editor breathing down my back, not even having an agent even curious to know what it's about. Like, to just be in that cave off by yourself where nobody knows what you're doing. No one's judging it. No one's waiting for it. No one's expecting it.
Yeah.
That was absolutely terrific, man. I love being back there because there's a difference. You know, I was talking to you before we started, like, you know, Black Buck is your first novel, and you were saying how you're working on your second novel right now. And I was telling you that like the second novel is actually more difficult because it's the first one that you do not write alone. Like from here on out, you never get to write alone again. Like, you can suppress voices to the back a little bit.
Yeah.
You never get to write alone again. And so that's why that first book is so special and that second book is so difficult. And so for me, Hell of a Book was, I wasn't 100% alone because again, I still had an agent. I still had like, you know, career stuff I was trying to do, but like, I was so far away from everyone as far as what everyone was expecting that it was able to be the thing it wanted to be more than the thing I wanted to be or the thing the editor wanted it to be. It was able to just be what it was. I think that was some of the specialness of writing it.
And I feel that. I feel that when I read it, that there was, what's the word? A high level of irreverence. Of you just wanting to write the book that you wanted to write, for it to resonate with the people you wanted it to resonate with, and for you to write it in the way that you wanted it. And I say this as someone who has said those same things over the past 6 months so many times, like real recognize real, like I feel that. And there was a question that I wanted to ask, but I'll get to it. But talking about you writing the book the way that you wanted to write it, the voice, the author's voice is different. And you mentioned those movies from, I don't know when, man, the 50s or even further back, the shoot 'em up black and white, where you got those slick white mobsters with the fedoras and the cigarettes, and somehow no one gets hit when they're shooting wildly. The guns probably weren't as sophisticated as the ones that we have now, even though none of us need them. How did you craft that voice, and why did you write it in that way? Because it is very, very different.
Yeah, it goes back to me wanting to just do the book that I wanted. Like, early writers, and I count myself in, it's like early writers, oftentimes you work from the framework of writers you admire, and that's how you're supposed to do it. Like, you know, you have these training wheels that you spend a lot of your career like looking back towards, like that. And I had done that for quite a while. And so for me, having no contract, just off in the woods by myself, I said, you know, if I'm gonna do this and no one's looking, then I'm gonna do what the hell I want. I'm gonna just make it the weirdest, awesomest book. Like, I'm really put myself into it more than anything else. And so I'm a big fan of film noir, which is that whole genre of the dudes in the fedoras and the guns, Humphrey Bogart. Like, it's such the language used in that. I'm such a fan of like language. I watched Deadwood, like anything with language is, you know, I'm already connected. And so I was watching that and I wanted to incorporate that. You know, then there's also the moments when like it gets away from that as well. You know, there's like Nick Cage references throughout the entire book. So I'm a massive Nick Cage fan.
It was hilarious,
dude. And it was such a fun write because like I was just throwing stuff at the wall and like having fun with it.
Yeah. When you were referring to Nick Cage, or when the author was referring to Nick Cage by his movies, Mr. This, that, and the other, I thought it was just so smart.
Dude, that was so fun. It was funny, like, so that scene came in really late in the process. My agent and I were editing the novel before we went to a publisher. We were editing it, and there were some other like sex scenes, and my agent was like, there's too many sex scenes here. They're kind of redundant. Like, I don't know what's going on here. And so I said, I'll make a deal with you. I said, I'll take out the sex scenes, but I'm putting Nick Cage in.
Yeah.
And she was like, dude, whatever, man. So all of a sudden, here's Nick Cage, and it completely worked out.
That's a note from my editor. She's in here too to support you. And shout out to Pilar. If I ever want to throw someone like Vin Diesel in a book randomly, I'm gonna have to ask that you please let me do it. All right. So you've said that this book is semi-autobiographical, and I think that it is courageous for you to just come out there and say it. Maybe not. Maybe it's just you just keeping it real. For me, I always try to troll people when they ask me how much of my book is actually me. I blur the lines in a way where they can't always tell. And perhaps that is a form of protecting myself or not giving too much of myself away. But you're saying that you put a certain portion of yourself in this book. And there are parts of this book that are very, very difficult to get through as a reader. So I can imagine what they were like for you as a writer. Parts dealing with bullying. Those parts, man, I hated those parts. I mean, I hated them because of what was happening. Right. I thought that the writing was incredible and it invoked all of those emotions in me, but they got me real mad because I was on a bus when I was reading that, you know, just in my mind at least, and seeing that play out and what it must have been like for that young boy to be the subject of bullying, right? And then there's parts of police brutality, and you don't write them sparing any detail. So I have two questions now that I said that, but the first is, how did you take care of yourself while writing this book? Or did you not need to? Were you able to put up a wall between you and the book in order to write it?
No, I definitely had to kind of do some self-care, as much as that term gets thrown around a lot. I had to kind of monitor myself as I was working on it, because again, like, yeah, there are parts of this that are directly copied and pasted from my actual lifetime experiences and memories and childhood. And then there are other parts that I've kind of borrowed and tweaked around from like those people around me. Like I said, like there are scenes in it that are pulled from events that occurred in the small town that I grew up in, like stories that belong to another family that I'm not going to, like, you know, out them and tell them their story. But like, so much of was finding that space. And I actually used the comedy in the book. Like, people oftentimes talk about how funny the book is, and the comedy was there. It's there for the reader secondarily, but it was primarily there to help me get through the act of writing it, because I couldn't just working on it. I could not simply do the heavy parts and leave my heart ripped out on the page every day. I had to come back in and laugh a little bit as I was working on it. So that's where a lot of the comedy came from, was me trying to like keep myself in the writing as I was working on all those difficult scenes.
I know it, brother. That second question that I wanted to ask, as I was asking you, the first one is, why did you decide to be so graphic and straightforward with some of these scenes, especially dealing with police brutality? You didn't sugarcoat any of it. And I don't want to give any spoilers away for those who haven't read the book. Right. But why was it important, I guess, for you to write them that way?
Because I think you have to. I think that part of the flaw and the challenge that we have as a society, and I would argue as a species, is we like to pretend that bad things don't happen, and we like to gloss over the bad things that are occurring.
Yep.
Because it makes our life easier. Like, if I can wake up in the morning and not be depressed when I read the headline, it's cool, I'm gonna skip that headline. Yeah. And that's the thing that we oftentimes do. And so in the writing of this, I didn't want the reader to, quote, skip the headline. Like, it's like, no, you got to get into the heart of the story and see the blood and the guts and the pain and the after effect that goes on for, all this extended amount of time. Like, you need to be there for that. You can't just show up for the good times and laugh and high five each other, like, oh, that was so hilarious, and then not expect the pain that goes with it. Because in the life of these characters, in my life, in the life of Black Americans, and Americans also large, but primarily Black Americans, like, yeah, we laugh, we make the music, we make the videos, we have the fun, but man, it comes at a cost. And people don't want to talk about that cost. They want to, they want to hear the music, they want to dance, they want all the positives and pretend the negatives aren't occurring. And that's part of the problem. So for me, there was no way I was letting readers get by with just experiencing the fun parts and not paying the piper, the same piper I have to pay that you have to pay. It's like, no, we got to share this. That's part of the problem. We don't share this thing. We got to share this thing for all of us to kind of get through it. So,
wow. I'm just processing that for a second. Sharing some of the responsibility or burden, if we want to call it, with the reader throughout the course of a couple hundred pages as the price for admission to a certain extent. right? That this is what you are going to get, an unabashed version of what it is like to be me or this person who looks like me on the page. I think that perhaps is the greatest gift that you gave the reader in this.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a couple more questions. In 10 minutes, we're going to be taking audience Q&A. We have 2 questions so far. People who are here right now, please drop anything and everything that comes to your mind. I'm not going to speak for Jason, but he is a cool cat, a sly character. So he will likely be able to answer anything that you ask. But a couple more questions from my end. You had just referenced people wanting to skip the headlines. And there is a part at the very end of the book that made me think of a few things. One was the work that it takes to digest reality. And 2 was this monologue that Dave Chappelle gave on SNL, where he says that I can't even tell the truth without a punchline. And I'm gonna quote this portion of the book that speaks to this. Names would just make it true, all of it, not just true, but real. I'm not sure we can let it be real. I'm not sure we could face that reality. Do you think that reality at times can become too overwhelming for people to even act, that there's this analysis paralysis? You or the author references it in the book many times by saying it would be too big. It would be too big for me to comprehend. What are your thoughts on that? And I'm not trying to place you on this pedestal as a guru, but what would be a word or 2 of advice that you would have for any human being, regardless of their background, in terms of digesting this reality in the world that we live in today? I know it's big.
Yeah, it's definitely big, man. Like we all have to take care of ourselves. Like we all exist, and we have these emotional states that are vulnerable and are subject to getting overwhelmed, because the world will overwhelm you. Life will overwhelm you, both on the small scale of like just people that you know, tragedies that happen to people you love, like it will overwhelm you. And then you stress it out to like trying to conquer the world, and like all the stuff you see on the news it's very difficult. And so I don't knock people for having to protect themselves. It's something that I do, something that we all do. But what I want to encourage people to actually do is make sure that your level of self-care doesn't come at the cost of other people's sanity and other people's lives sometimes. And I think that's part of the problem. There's a large demographic in America in particular who their self-care is harming a huge amount of other people, because they don't want to have certain conversations that are difficult, because they don't want certain things taught in schools, because they don't want a certain narrative of what America is or is supposed to be exposed as a false narrative. They're willing to sacrifice a lot of other people and the health and safety of others. And that's when it becomes a problem. So the encouragement that I would say to people is, yeah, take care of yourself, but make sure you're taking care of other people too. Like make sure that you are also making space for them to live the lives that they want to live, while you're trying to like carve out your own space as well. Like Americans have this belief of like the zero-sum economy, the zero-sum equation. Like I think, bred from capitalism, where like, if I win, if somebody else is winning, then it means I can't win too. And it's like, no, that's totally not the case. Like we can all win. We just gotta we gotta actually like reach out and help each other and like be aware of each other. Even that in and of itself, the ability to see people and recognize them as like meaningful people in the world. Yeah, it's a hard thing to do.
No, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you taking the time to share your own thoughts, right? Because there's always a person behind the book. And within this book itself, right, you're given the real, depicting many scenarios, like I was saying, viscerally, but you're also displaying so many contrasting opinions of those various scenarios, of what it means to live in this nation, of what it means to be Black, of the responsibility or lack thereof that people have with contending with the reality that we all experience. Why did you blur these lines so much? It would have been much cleaner for the reader for you to just give them a nice sort of bottled answer like you gave us just now, of this is how I think that people should live. This is how I think that you should think. But there are so many contrasting opinions in this book, where you see these characters who could be racist. You see these characters who have inflicted some level of violence on Black folk, and they're humanized to a point, to a certain extent, where you're like, you know what? I see where you're coming from, man. Why did you write it in that way?
Because I wanted, as much as it is an absurdist text and is meant to be this farcical at times, I wanted to be realistic in how people behave. Like, life isn't black and white. Like, you know, people, no one is the villain in their own story. We're all heroes in our own mind. So even the people that are doing terrible things, they believe they're doing the best thing possible. They're making the best choices. And so when you encounter characters who, all of whom believe they are doing the good things, to them they are, and you have to find that space to, that's part of what empathizing is. Empathizing is, you know, not agreeing with always, but actually like understanding their point of view and like being able to feel the thing that they're feeling and then steer that in a certain direction. So what I wanted to do with this was, I didn't want to just preach at readers for, you know, 300 pages and say, oh, this is how you should be doing stuff because this person's evil, this person's good. It's like, no, like, we're all this really weird mix of good and evil, and we do some really awesome stuff, we do some terrible stuff, but let's start steering it a little bit more towards doing those positive things and actually like recognizing that people do exist. Like, one of the big recurring themes in this is this idea of people being seen and being unseen. And one of the greatest flaws of humanity is our ability to not see each other. That is something that the brain wants to exclude data. Like the brain says, oh, people are people, and just put them into a block of like abstract concepts. You don't see that like lives are being lived every day, man. You walk by people on the street and you don't recognize they're living entire lives just as rich as yours are. I think that's part of the problem that we all have as people.
Wow. We don't see their own histories, right? Like everyone has their own history. And one thing that I peeped is that history is a central theme of this book. The history that the author is trying to hand down to the kid whenever the kid appears. And for the reader, right, if you haven't read the book, then you'll meet the kid, and you'll know that the kid is a young man that could or could not be real, who's appearing to the author throughout the course of the novel. There is Soot's mother, Soot, another character whose story is running parallel to the author's in hell of a book. You discuss epigenetics, and for those who aren't familiar with epigenetics, it's basically the genetic concept that all of us are carrying things from our forebears, from our ancestors, literally in our genes. And it is brought up oftentimes when discussing Black people who are the offspring of formerly or enslaved individuals, and what that trauma means genetically or biologically and how it manifests today. So why was it important for you to focus on history and to make sure to provide historical context on so much of what transpires in this novel?
Because for those all those reasons you just mentioned, like there is that epigenetic kind of component, but there's also just the reality that, you know, history informs our present in so many degrees that people want to pretend aren't real. You know, people argue about, oh, that was 100 years ago, that was 20, that was however many years ago. It's like, yeah, and we're still paying for it. Like we're still caught up in how that works. And I wanted to make that the forefront of the storytelling and like make that big component. There's a section there where we talk about the South being America's longest running crime scene.
I love that line. I love that line.
Because it is like, it's still going on. Like we're still trying to solve problems and trying to deal with the after effects, or some of us trying to deal with it, others are trying to ignore the after effects. Like there's that whole conversation to be had there. But we can't pretend that history isn't a part of what's happening in America right now. And again, especially with the move now to kind of get rid of critical race theory in schools, and like there's this move to pretend that the past has not influenced the present, and the past does not continue to influence the present and will not influence the future. And that is terrifying. Like that is such a flawed piece of logic and a flawed way for people to exist, that the novel had to approach that. I had to kind of talk about that.
This collective forgetting, right? I'm not going to ask you a question about COVID or the pandemic, but I do often think about it. Like, provided all of this improves to the point where people have the luxury of forgetting it, will they? Right? Because it was so traumatic, and no one wants to remember what we're experiencing right now. All right, one last question. It's a selfish one. Sorry, audience. It's a craft question. How did you know when to move the focus from the author story to Soot?
Oh man, you want to know how the secret sauce is made?
Yeah. Come on, man, put a young author on,
dude. So honestly, a lot of that is feel like,
yeah.
and this is, I know that's not like the easiest answer, but like there isn't like a, like, you know, I've been writing seriously for like, I would say 20 years now, 10 years full time, but like 20 years like really focusing on the craft.
Yeah.
And I'm still learning things about writing, and so doing the dual narrative has been something that I've done since the return. Like all of my novels have had some form of dual narrative. Like, so dual narrative is just a thing that I, for whatever reason, it helps me tell my stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so learning when to change focus from one character to another is a matter of learning that writing is one thing I teach my grad students when I teach grad students is you have to progress to the point. The highest level of writing you can achieve is understanding that writing is a two-player game. It's not just about you fighting the page. It's not just about you fighting the words. It's not about you fighting the narrative in your head, trying to get it down the right way. That's kind of like intermediate level writing.
Yeah.
The longer you go on, you realize this is a thing that I'm doing to convince the reader of a certain emotion or a certain idea. I'm making an argument, either emotionally or intellectually. And so in order to make that argument, I've got to swing back and forth. I've got to move to this other area, which will change their focus and change their way of thinking.
Wow.
In this other kind of space. And that's what that shift is. That shift is this idea of like, you're moving your reader along and saying, okay, I've made you feel this for this period of time. Now I'm going to move you over here. And that's the part that takes time. Like from a writing standpoint, that's the hardest thing to do, is like anticipate your reader and really steer the reader, not yourself, but steer the reader into a space. So that's kind of how those learning to when to shift those over. That's kind of where that comes from.
That is masterful. And thank you for sharing that. It makes me realize that there's a difference between nudging a reader and having them not even feel your hand on their back, and then like pushing them across the dance floor, like, yo, what'd you do?
Exactly.
I don't like this experience. So thank you for sharing. We're going to get into audience questions right now. We have 3 that we're going to address, but anyone else in the audience, please drop your questions in there and we'll get to it.
Please do.
A light one from a woman who I'm pretty sure you're familiar with, named Jamie Knapp.
Yes.
What do you think is Nick Cage's best movie?
Oh, dude, you're gonna ask me the hard. Jamie always asks the hard questions. So for me, it's 2. I got 2 options here. Is either going to, well, 3 options. I'm just say all of his movies. No, there's 3. There's Raising Arizona, which was him and the Coen brothers. I'm a huge Coen brothers fan.
Okay.
There is Lord of War, which is a very heavy political kind of topic that most people don't see. And then more recently, there's a movie called Mandy, which is unlike anything you have ever seen ever in life. It is the trippiest, weirdest, most amazing movie I've ever seen. So those 3 are my picks for Nick Cage movies.
Hell yeah, there you go. Casey Davis asked a question that you might have partially answered already. Critical race theory in education and politics is currently such a hot button topic. What are your personal thoughts as to where we are today?
I think that the move to get rid of critical race theory is terrible, quite frankly. I think it comes from, kind of like I was saying before, it comes from this desire to build a certain narrative of what America is. D.L. Hughley, on his talk show one time, I was listening to him. He talks about America has a brochure, and people oftentimes come to America based upon what the brochure said. And then when they get here, they find out that it's not quite what the brochure said. And I feel like this move to get rid of critical race theory is very akin to that, where people want to scrub out and erase the parts of American history that don't fit the brochure because they want to keep that brochure alive. And the reality is, like, no, if you love a thing, you have to recognize its flaws and be willing to fix those flaws and make it better. So rather than try to get rid of critical race theory, what we need to do is be embracing it and trying to find out how to get rid of it, how to fix the racial issues. And I mean, there's nothing more racist than trying to pretend that racism didn't exist. Like that's the irony. I don't understand how people don't understand that. It's like, you don't get any more racist than that. Like you just don't. So yeah, my current outlook on like where things are, I try to be an optimist. Like I really think that there are enough, like I teach undergrad sometimes, and like the young students are such a breath of fresh air because there is such optimism there, and there is such a desire to change and a desire for their voices to be heard. So my hope is that eventually they will make the changes happen that are trying to be undone by certain older generations. I think the new crowd is going to fix a lot of things. Or at least I hope they are.
That's the feeling that I get about young people in general, that they look at older folk like us, and say, you all have been bugging for decades. What's wrong with you? Who cares about this thing? Why do you care about this thing or this, that, and the other? Or why can't we let people know that they are human just as much as us, you know, regardless of where they come from? So do you feel really in your bones that this next generation is just gonna like burn everything that doesn't serve humanity to the ground? Or, and this is one of my own questions, sorry audience, or do you feel like there still will be those who have learned things from their parents, from their grandparents, and hold on to those traditions?
No, I don't think anything is getting burned to the ground anytime soon. I think that big dramatic changes like that rarely occur. They do occur, but it's very rare. Because again, there's so many generations of indoctrination that you have to undo to have those moments actually occur, that I think is, while not impossible, is just very slim. So again, I think that what will happen is you'll see this continuous, because it's been happening. Like there's this continuous slow march towards more equality and more humane treatment of each other. The problem is there are these backslides. Like people get tired of waiting. I'm tired of waiting. Like everyone is tired of waiting for the day when things are better, because but I do believe that on the long enough timeline, it will trend towards that kind of equality, that kind of space. But it's going to be a hard fought battle. Like there's always going to be the people who push it in the other direction, the people who want it to go back to the way, the good old days, the way it was, whatever you want to call it. The good old days were only good for like, a certain demographic of people. For everybody else,
that mint julep on the porch type day.
Exactly. The old mint julep. Yeah, that's exactly it, dude. Like that nostalgia that people have. Things were simpler when I was a kid. No, they weren't. I guarantee they weren't, dude. You were simpler when you were a kid. The world was not simpler when you were a kid. And that goes for anybody of any age. Like it always makes my head hurt, especially when people are like, so I'm 43. I get people my age talking about how it was simple. No, it wasn't, dude. Like I was there. It wasn't simple back then, dude. We didn't know how jacked up the world was.
That's right.
And I think that's the phenomenon people are always fighting against, this idea that like things used to be better. No, they weren't, man. They weren't. You were just not as aware of how bad things were. And that's a gift. That's one of the gifts of childhood, that you don't know how bad the world is. But eventually you got to be an adult and embrace it and try to change it.
That's right. They'll be like, oh, back in my day, a piece of candy was 5 cents. What about the people who didn't have a penny?
Exactly. Exactly.
Speaking about childhood, there's a question from Jamie Thomas. Thank you for this space and the book. What about the kid do you want readers to sit with the most after reading?
That's a good question. I kind of want people to see the kid as, I'm trying not to give too many spoilers.
Yeah, we didn't really discuss the kid that much.
Yeah, exactly. Because the kid is a complicated character. Like he is in very, very many ways a representation of a lot of the kids and a lot of the demographics that the book is talking about. Like the kid is tied to Trayvon Martin. The kid is tied to all these other kids who lose their childhoods. Like and losing your childhood doesn't always just mean getting shot by police or dying in whatever way. Like losing your childhood also means the recognition that because of your skin color, the world is different. There's a scene in the book where a lot of the books tries to discuss what parents do when they have that discussion to talk with their kids. Like my parents had it with me, and I'll have my nieces and nephews, and it's part of the Black experience.
Same.
And so the kid is trying to find his space in that. The kid is someone who is at this point where he understands that the world is different, and he's trying to figure out how to make sense of that. And he wants the author to help him out. So for readers, I want them to kind of really understand that the kid is universal. The kid is someone that, like, all the adults that who are Black were the kid at some point in their lives. All of their children are the kids. Like this is a universal component where, like, you find out the American narrative is not your narrative. James Baldwin said it back in the 60s, like the American narrative, at some point you realize is not yours. Your narrative is different. And what do you do with that? Like what part of your voice gets squashed and destroyed because you know that the rules are different for you? That's what the kid is trying to figure out and trying to discuss. That's what I want readers to kind of take away from that.
Yeah, as I was reading it, I was like, damn, some young ones should be reading this book as well. What do you think is like the youngest age that a young adult should be to pick this book up and make sense of it?
Dude, I think my hope is that it'll be a book that people can pick up as 5, 6, 7, like when you're young, and have it grow with you. Like There'll obviously be components and themes that are over, you know, certain kids' heads.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 that you do realize you're different, and you did nothing wrong. You were just born with a certain skin color, and now the American narrative is completely different from you, and you spend arguably your entire life trying to figure out what that means. Or at least I spent a large part of my life, and even still today, I'm trying to figure out what that truly means to me. Like, what got taken away when I understood that? What did I gain when I understood that? Like, where's the balance sheet for that moment when you realize that things are dramatically different for you? And so for me, like, I wrote it with, you know, adults in mind, but with children in mind too, because I think that's a question that they struggle with, and that's a question they spend a lot of time struggling with. Is like, how do you navigate that when the world is different for you? And parents, I want parents to have that discussion a bit more. Like, part of the talk is that the rules are different from you, but I would love it if this book becomes a place where parents and children can talk about, Mom, Dad, what did you do when you found out that it was different? And how did you navigate that? How do you deal with the anger? Like, I remember my teenage years were being angry at white people and angry at America, because it was me processing things are different from me just because I'm Black, and trying to find that space. And I think that's what the book wants to talk about as well.
It's like, I don't know, we're in public right now, so I'm not going to dive into the trauma of it, but there's this feeling that it feels so unfair. You're like, yo, what the hell?
Yep.
And it's not like I mean, some people I'm sure want to change the color of their skin, but it's more so this, you're like flabbergasted, like, yo, out of all the possible worlds that we as a species could have built, we built this one. What? There's a loss of innocence, right? And you discuss this in the book, but you're also saying right now that parents should have this talk. I mean, it's like you have to run a cost-benefit analysis on the benefits of having this talk with young Black and brown folk of, you are different. These institutions will treat you differently, but more specifically, cops will treat you differently. Put your hands up, say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. Make sure that you walk away afterwards. Not that you retain your life, but that you walk away. It's such a balancing act. I mean, I want to know your thoughts on, I don't even know how to articulate this question. Like, is there ever a time when ignorance is bliss for a young Black person in America? And when an adult in their life, whether it be an uncle, a guardian, an older friend that is like related to the family, but not in a weird way, you know what I'm saying? Is there ever a time for older folk to allow a Black child to be a child?
No, wholeheartedly, man. Like, and that, so I'm gonna tell you a personal, weird, wacky story that I haven't told many people. So when I was a kid, like, you know, I'm an old head, but when I was a kid, like back in the day in the South, like there was this, you know, Dukes of Hazzard used to come on TV, and like, if you don't know what that is, it's a show about these two good old boys driving a, you know, the General Lee's orange car, orange Confederate
flag.
Yeah, with the flag on the top, right? Had the Confederate flag on the top of that mug, right? So me being like, I was pretty young at the time, it was reruns. I was super young. I didn't even know what the flag was. It was just a cool show where dudes drove a car and jumped bridges and did all kind of wild stuff. So I love that show, dude. Loved it more than anything else. And this is gonna sound really stupid. I'm telling the story anyway. Like, I used to want like the old, like the Dukes of Hazzard bed sheets. Like, just like, oh, you know, your kid, you want to get the bed sheets, the thing you love, dude. My mom, bless her heart, up in heaven right now, bless her heart, dude. My mom went out and bought me these damn General Lee emblazoned bed sheets for me to sleep on, because all she knew was her son loved this show and he was too innocent to know the reality of the history behind the things that he was buying. Wow. And it's funny because years later, when I was about 19 or so, not long before she passed away, she retold me this whole story because I'd forgotten about it. And she's like, yeah, she's like, you would not believe the looks I got when I went to the store and I buy these bed sheets, and this white lady is ringing me up with these bed sheets that have the Confederate flag emblazoned all across them. But I wanted you to have them because that was a show you loved, and I knew you didn't know any better, and it didn't matter. You were just in love with the show, and you got these things. So like, wholeheartedly, there are these moments in people's lives where like Black and brown and minority children deserve to have their childhoods. The sadness of America is they don't get to keep their childhood as long as other kids do. And that's the problem. That's the thing that we need to be working towards. Like, they should be allowed to stay children just as long as white kids are. And they're not. And that's part of the problem.
Ooh, what a story, man. There's one last question, and I want to end it on this note because it's so powerful, but I will ask this question from CB. Thank you both for your books. I'll ask you right now, what's a book that you have recently read and liked?
I'm gonna shout out Black Buck all day long. Like just I gotta put that out there all day long. So that goes without saying, dude. Mateo's a hell of a damn writer. So there's that one, and then there's also, I'm reading a book right now called Monsters. It's a graphic novel by an artist named Barry Windsor Smith. I've been a big fan of his like my entire life, and it's actually also a discussion on like American history, World War II, race. Like there's a lot of stuff going on here as well. So I encourage people to check that out as well. Definitely pick up Black Buck. If you ain't got it yet, you need to go do it.
Yeah, you can read that later. Jason, thank you so much, man, for your time, for your candor, for again interacting with me as a young Black writer and just sharing all of your wisdom, man. It is piercing and it's necessary, and I just appreciate it so much. But most of all, thank you for writing a hell of a book. Yes, I worked it in there. Thank you so much, folks from the Center for Fiction. I don't know if you're going to come back on and say a few words, but thank you for hosting us. Looking forward to all that you're going to do with this. And I can't wait until we can link in person, brother. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for having me, man. This was an awesome interview, dude. Thanks so much for doing it, man. And thanks for everybody else for coming along, man.
Peace.